Hello, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. My name is Beth Ann. Today I am doing the Pain Over Joy tag, which is an original tag by Lady Lovestead Reed, so I will link her original tag video below. And I didn't write down who I was tagged by. Crap. All right, I will link whoever tagged me in the description box below, because that's written down in another room. Yeah, this tag has been very popular on BookTube, and I don't know about anyone else, but it has been blowing my mind. So before I get into the tag, though, I want to do a quick science plug. So this week I am hip deep in grant reports for grants that pay me to do my job, and understandably want a report, an update to know whether I'm doing my job. And for some reason, even though it's always at the end of June, I'm not aware of that. And then it's a panic, and it's great, and it's fun. It's nice, like, summarizing your work. But anyway, that's what I'm doing. And in the course of doing this, I was asking various people for updates on their work that needs to go into these grant reports. And a student of mine basically sort of reminded me that he has a conference talk that's publicly available on YouTube. So his name is Josh, and he worked for me last summer and is now working for me again this summer, collecting data in tallgrass prairie in Illinois. And in particular, what he's studying is the interaction of bison and bees. You might be like, what on earth do those two types of organisms have to do with each other? And we're trying to figure it out. So one cool thing about bison is where they exist in prairie, they make wallows. So they roll on the ground in the dirt for various reasons, and they like to do it in sort of specific spots that they choose. And so we end up with these areas of open, loose soil, and they're sort of just little spots in the prairie where these wallows are made. And so for bees, many of whom nest in soil, this is potentially a nesting resource that we see in prairies that have bison, and don't see in prairies that don't have bison, which is most prairie, because bison were almost driven extinct by Europeans. So it's pretty cool. So anyway, so if you would like to see some gorgeous pictures of bees nesting, his talk is about 9.5 minutes long, and I will link to it down below. It is not sort of like a science talk with like results and statistics and graphs, because he gave it last November, when he'd only been out of the field season for a couple months, so hadn't even processed all of his data. So it's more of like an ideas talk and a beautiful pictures talk. And a natural history talk. So very accessible to a broad audience. So if you want to know anything about bees and how they might or might not be using these bison wallows, please go check that out. All right, that said, Pain Over Joy tag. So I would like to tag Liz at For Booking Out Loud and Sneha at Sneha's Tomes. And I think neither of you has done this tag. I just tried to go check really quickly. But I've always enjoyed Liz's channel. And so Liz, I would love to hear your thoughts. And Sneha is a fairly new follow for me, but I've been enjoying her channel quite a bit, and her thoughts about a wide variety of books. So Sneha, I would also love to hear your opinions about this tag. So a lot of the people that I follow have taken this tag in more of a sort of philosophical and intellectual direction. And I think I might go back to more of what I think is the original intent of the person who created the tag, which is thinking very specifically about genre fiction, and in particular about the term guilty pleasure as it is applied to the romance genre, or the women's fiction genre, or the chick lit genre. And I would also throw in sci-fi and fantasy into sort of the guilty pleasure category, just thinking about things that I hear other people judging readers for. So I feel like I hear, just culturally, people get judged for reading romance, they get judged for reading fantasy or sci-fi. I think things like thrillers and mysteries are a little bit more acceptable, but there still are people that will judge those genres as sort of not being high intellectual caliber, of being a guilty pleasure. And so I think that is sort of the the context that the original tag was written in. And the original tag also was inspired by a quote from Christina Lauren, and I believe they are a duo author who have written some really, successful works like In a Holidays and The Unhoneymooners and things like that, which are not books that I've read, but I do read romance. So so in that context of thinking about sort of guilty pleasures and genre fiction, the first prompt is, do you mostly read books illustrating pain or books illustrating joy, and why? And so I would say that I read a good mix. And in the past, I've definitely been more on the illustrating joy side because I have read very heavily in those genre fiction categories, specifically sci-fi and fantasy. I sort of grew up reading. And those, even if terrible things are happening to characters, like it's so removed because it's in another world. And that sort of escapist aspect of escaping your reality into another reality, to me, that's illustrating joy. Like that is a joyous process. I don't know. But this is the problem that everybody is running into doing these tags of like, what does it mean for a book to illustrate pain or illustrate joy? Like there aren't actually that many books where like they are about pain. They're usually about other things. And pain for the characters or joy for the characters is sort of something that's like happening or is being used as a mechanic to drive action forward. But the book isn't fundamentally about pain or about joy. So I see why people sort of struggle with answering this tag. So all that said, I feel like I can have equally strong emotional reactions to both books that have a lot of pain in them or seem to center pain, and books that have a lot of joy in them and center joy. I would say that I'm probably, like, I can sort of experience equally intense reactions, but my threshold might be lower for books illustrating pain, if that makes sense. Like to hit the emotional high is easier in books that have pain in them than in books that have joy. It has to be a really, really good joyful book, I think, or with some really, really good joyful things, if that makes sense. All right. Prompt number 2, do you see books about pain as more intellectually valuable? Why or why not? And so I think another issue that other people have been running into in this tag is like, what on earth does intellectually valuable mean? And I really struggle with that because to me, intellectually valuable really, is not a value term. Like I'm not going to say a book that has intellectual value. Oh my gosh. So I'm using the word a lot. All right. A book that is intellectual is not inherently more valuable than a book that is not intellectual. And to me, intellectual, because I am an academic, I'm a researcher, so intellectual has a much more narrow definition. It's really about sort of creating knowledge or synthesizing knowledge. So a literary fiction book, like a Faulkner book or something, for example, that to me is not an intellectual book. And I think some readers sort of categorize things like a Faulkner novel or a Toni Morrison novel or, some literary fiction that can be categorized as something that sort of makes you think and challenges you. But to me, that doesn't mean that it's intellectual. Intellectual is literally about knowledge generation or synthesis, which is a little bit hard to do in fiction. Not that it can't be done, but so no, and I don't think that books about pain are necessarily more intellectually valuable. Knowledge is not necessarily painful or joyful, if that makes sense. Although sometimes it can feel painful if you're studying something difficult. I don't know. I hope I'm making sense. Given that this is about fiction, I very rarely feel that a fiction book is intellectual. It might be emotionally deep as opposed to a book that is not emotionally deep. But I would say that term intellectual really throws me thinking about this tag. And no, I don't think that reading a textbook or a nonfiction narrative, I don't think that is inherently more valuable than fiction. I think fiction is an integral part of being human. We've been doing fiction forever. Look at religion, mythology, folktales. We really value fiction and we need it to survive. So no, I do not think that intellectual reading is inherently more valuable. Okay, prompt number 3. Why do you think major book prizes like the Booker and the Pulitzer mainly award books about pain? Maybe because they've been male dominated. Like, I haven't thought through that link, but like I think there's a reason why romance as a genre is just huge, like it's a joyful genre. It's mostly women who read it and it's huge, and so it's like, maybe we have these like long-standing prizes that seem to prioritize pain because everything has been male dominated. And if we'd had female dominated book prizes and publishing for the past several hundred years, would the world look different? I don't know. Um, so that's my thought about that. Feel free to crucify me in the comments if you like. But that said, I do think there is something interesting about pain. So I think maybe a lot of people experience joy more similarly than they experience pain, like in their own lives. Like I think there might be sort of more, I don't know if more like diversity in the way that we experience pain is right. There's definitely a lot more questioning about pain. There's always that, why am I in this painful, sad situation? Why is this happening to me? And so I think that can make us turn toward literature and reading for answers. And when we're feeling joyful, we're not sitting around thinking, why me? Why is this happy thing happening to me? We're just enjoying it. And so I think that sort of the search for answers that I think we often go through when we're reading painful books or sort of very emotionally hard books, I think that might be part of why, at least in some cases, like the big prizes, books about pain can be awarded those more. I hope I'm making sense. All right, prompt number 4. Do you use and agree with the phrase guilty pleasure? Why or why not? So I never use guilty pleasure really to apply to my own reading. I will use it to fit someone else's language, if that makes sense. If I'm talking to someone who I know thinks that romance is a guilty pleasure, or I think they might, like if another scientist asks me, oh, you said you like reading. What do you read in your spare time? I might be like, oh, well, my guilty pleasure is, high fantasy or something. And it's not because I actually think it's a guilty pleasure. It's because I'm trying to meet the social expectation, which in science is that you do science all the time and you're not allowed to have a life. So yeah, so it's just an interesting thing, and I've sort of always been that way. So growing up, there were like books where like I didn't want my mom to know that I was reading them. Not that she would have had a huge problem with it, but like smutty romance or like some sort of mediocre fantasy, like I knew she would be like, "Why are you reading that?" And like it would be fine. But it's like I didn't feel bad for reading it. It was just like my life is easier if my mom doesn't know that I'm reading it, right? So yeah, so I use guilty pleasure to meet other people's expectations, but I don't feel guilt or shame for my reading choices, if that makes sense. Prompt number 5, do you think books centering joy are guilty pleasures? I think that our society codes them that way, and I think it's ridiculous. We're all sort of looking for pleasure and things that we enjoy, and we enjoy different things at different times. Sometimes you literally enjoy making yourself sad by reading a book about pain. So, that could be a guilty pleasure. Like, yeah. Prompt number 6, do you read in secret? Are there books you read but never talk about because of embarrassment, shame, or guilt about liking them? So definitely in middle school and high school, there were the books where I was like, I just don't want to have to talk to my mom about this book. So we're gonna like hide it so she doesn't know about it. But again, not like I had friends that I would read those books with. So it was like secret from one person and not secret from others, Now that I'm on BookTube, I have been thinking about this actually because there's a bit of judgment on BookTube about self-help books, and those are not things that I read with any regularity. But especially since being married, like occasionally, yeah, I'll pick up a book about relationships. There's actually one that my husband and I read together, just because like I haven't learned anything sort of like groundbreaking or mind-bending from books like that, but it can be a useful way to contextualize or provide some framing for a problem that you're having, or something that you couldn't quite put words to. Like it can just be a sort of a tool for communicating with other people in your life. And so I'm like, if I read another self-help book, am I going to talk about it on BookTube? I don't know. I think I probably will, because I'm generally not a person that feels shame. So, and then prompt number 7, who do you tag? I already tagged some people. So one thing I just wanted to circle back to, or not circle back to, I wanted to just introduce, and I couldn't, as I was going through this in the moment, I couldn't figure out how to fit it into a prompt. But I think one conversation I've seen coming up in other people's pain over joy tags is something like books about pain can sort of change the world or can shift society in ways that books about joy maybe can't. And I actually think some of the shifts that have been happening in the romance genre recently are sort of in direct opposition to that. So the fact that we're getting a lot more sort of mainstream, widely read romance books that show non-traditional relationships, so relationships that aren't heterosexual relationships between cisgendered people, I think is incredibly powerful. And even romance books that have a heterosexual cisgender relationship, a lot of modern romance is much more female empowering, like explicitly female empowering, than a lot of other areas of literature. And I think that's incredibly powerful. I mean, it's great if everybody reads that sort of book, but if even like a cisgendered woman or a queer person or a transgender person, like if you read a romance that has a person that you identify with and have things in common with, and you see them in a well-written romance where they have a very fulfilling relationship at the end of the book, where they're respected and they find trust and joy and pleasure, like that is powerful, because then you know what to ask for and what to fight for in your real life relationships. And so I think, I don't remember any videos that have been having that conversation, but I think that's, been one point that's come up about some of our books about pain more intellectually valuable. And I think that issue of representation really can't be underplayed in how important it is, and how genre fiction can really push representation into more of the forefront and give people models that speak to them in ways that that sort of some of the more traditional literature that often focuses on pain doesn't do. So I just wanted to put that out there. And then one other thing that I've been thinking about is this separation of the intellectual from the pleasure. And I like to think, I think for my job, again, as an academic and an intellectual, and I enjoy that. I wouldn't think so much if I didn't like it. And sometimes it drives me crazy, but these things are very difficult to separate. And so I think partly, this tag, I think it's really cool it's been amazing watching people's responses. And I think one of the big things is that it is making people think pretty critically about, what do we define as like pain versus joy in books? What do we think about the publishing industry as like binning all of these different things in different ways? So yeah, just to sort of flag that again, as a lot of people have been doing as part of this conversation. Okay, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to finish my beer. It's Tuesday. I hope y'all are having a good week. I hope you're enjoying reading whatever you're reading. If you want to see more of my content, please hit the subscribe button, and I will see you all in the next video. Thanks. Bye.